A young National Guardsman is fatally shot inside his own home, leading a 19-year-old woman to come face-to-face with a judge after she allegedly revealed a shocking explanation to police surrounding a romantic round of foreplay and one deadly mistake. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Oh, look, we cover a lot of stories about gun violence and shootings. Just comes with covering the world of true crime. And the majority of them, I would say, involve allegations of targeted violence. Maybe it's a relationship that goes south. Maybe it's someone who's out for revenge. Even in cases where we see accidental shootings, there are things that unfortunately we see over and over again. Maybe it's a young person in a home that might grab a gun that wasn't locked up the way that it should be, and it leaves someone dead. We've seen those things before. But this case is something I don't think I have ever seen since we've started this show. So let's break down this story out of Virginia, because the circumstances, again, are something you just don't see on the day-to-day. Both parties deliberately playing with fire and ending up in a situation that they cannot take back, and one person losing their life. It's a story that Ember McSpadden, 19 years old, allegedly told police after her 26-year-old romantic partner was found shot to death inside his home. She's now facing up to a decade behind bars on a charge of involuntary manslaughter. So there are a lot of shocking details in this case. We have all of them from police, and we're also learning more about the victim, someone who served this country, served overseas in combat, someone who knows, it would appear, the consequences of using a deadly weapon. And we'll be talking about what more this suspect could be charged with, if there's anything more she could be charged with, when defense attorney and former prosecutor Matthew Mangino joins me here in a little bit. But before I get to that, I want to break down what we know at this point. Let's go back to where all of this began. And it starts on March 5th of this year in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Rescue 3, ambulance 1420P, EMS 1, battalion 100, responding for a gunshot wound at Virginia Beach Boulevard.
And according to court documents, 19-year-old Ember McSpadden calls 911, 1:09 in the morning, and she says that her partner, 26-year-old Shane Brooks, was shot. And it was while they were, quote, playing a game. So Virginia Beach police, at that point, know that they have to get to this house and know that something terrible has happened. So they get to a location that was determined to be the home of Brooks, and they find him with a gunshot wound, one shot to the neck. He was pronounced dead at the scene. McSpadden, she's then taken into custody on a charge of involuntary manslaughter. So according to WAVY television, the autopsy shows that Brooks dies from a single gunshot wound to the head right under his chin. Now, when you hear about a gunshot wound in that particular location, and this is another sad reality of true crime, I mean, we cover these things, it could appear that a person took their own life. But the defendant in this case, McSpadden, she says that is not what happened. She says no one was expecting to die that night from their, quote, game. Now, more details were just revealed at a preliminary hearing, and the lead forensic investigator with the Virginia Beach Police testifies about what McSpadden told them. According to this investigator, McSpadden said that her and Brooks were in a, quote, friends with benefits sexual relationship. Brooks's brother, though, did tell WAVY television that the two of them only knew each other for around 3 months, and McSpadden was not considered to be Brooks's girlfriend. But during their friends with benefits relationship, McSpadden allegedly tells the investigator that she and Brooks would use knives and guns as sexual foreplay. When searching Brooks's home, the investigator testified they found 7 guns in the room where Brooks died. That includes 2 revolvers on the bed, even though it's unclear of how many of those firearms were actually used in the pair's sexual activities. Now, regardless, in this particular instance, McSpadden allegedly said that Brooks handed her a gun with 1 loaded bullet. It's a scenario similar to Russian roulette. McSpadden allegedly tells the investigator that both her and Brooks would check after they spun the gun cylinder to make sure that it wasn't on a live round. And McSpadden claims that she clicked the trigger multiple times, but on the last pass, a bullet discharged into Brooks at close range, ultimately killing him. Now, as I mentioned, McSpadden was charged with involuntary manslaughter back in March, and she was initially denied bond. But according to her court docket, she is currently out on bond, though the dollar amount remains undisclosed. But following the preliminary hearing, so that hearing was on August 14th, a judge found that there was enough probable cause to move this case forward, and the involuntary manslaughter charge has been sent to a grand jury. Now, following the hearing, McSpadden's attorney sent 10 on Your Side, was the local television station in Virginia, this following statement, quote, "This incident is a tragedy that my client deeply regrets, as evidenced by her emotional reaction during our hearing. As the evidence presented in court demonstrated, this was a tragic accident that my client had no intention or foresight would occur." Now, as of now, McSpadden's next scheduled court date is October 21st, so we will have to wait and see if the grand jury brings back an indictment. But remember, as McSpadden awaits her fate in the justice system, you have this family of someone who served overseas, grieving the loss of their loved one, 26-year-old Shane Brooks. According to his obituary, he graduated from Old Dominion University in Virginia. He had a degree in science. He was described as a well-decorated marathon runner who also loved spending time outdoors through hunting, fishing, and even flying. He had his pilot's license. And he also served his country as a staff sergeant in the Virginia National Guard for a decade. He did a 9-month tour in Iraq. The obituary concluded the following, saying, quote, "Though his time here was far too short, Shane made a lasting impact on everyone who knew him. He will be remembered for his adventurous spirit, his strength, and his incredibly sweet and kind heart. Above all, he will be remembered for the love he so freely shared with those closest to him." Joining us now to talk more about this is criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Matt Mangino. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. Very unique case, to say the least. I don't know if I've covered one like this before, but let's just say you are the prosecutor on this case. The detective comes to you, tells you what McSpadden told him about that night. Like, what is the strategy that leads you to this manslaughter charge?
Well, I think the strategy is that obviously this is not an intentional act. This isn't something that the two of them, the victim and the shooter, contemplated. This wasn't something they set out to do, to kill one another or kill one of the two of them. But that doesn't absolve you from criminal responsibility. Okay, so under the law, she's charged with involuntary manslaughter. And involuntary manslaughter is an accidental killing. Okay, and that's what appears happen here. Whatever they were doing, however they had this set up, however long they've been involved in this kind of foreplay, as it's been described, the intent wasn't to kill, but there was a death that resulted, and I think that's what prosecutors are focusing on.
Because, you look at her story, there are no witnesses. She's the only witness that was there. How do you figure out that, at least for, it seems like the detective, I mean, he's testified that he believes this is what happened, that this was some, hey, everybody's got whatever they're into. I mean, certainly this is very dangerous, but, they're into this foreplay, and then, this ends up happening. And the narrative reportedly that law enforcement is giving out is that he gives her the gun. Apparently it's placed beneath his chin, and then she pulls the trigger 3 times. How do you get to the point where you believe that that is a plausible story?
Well, I'm guessing that this is based on her own admissions, that she was interviewed. She tells police, "Hey, this is something we did. This was something we were into. He has a military background. He has these firearms, and this is something that we did, for kicks." And unfortunately, in this situation, one bullet was entered into the chamber. It was turned. We did what we normally did for whatever thrills it gave us. And when I pulled the trigger the 3rd time, a bullet was in the chamber, and he was hit in the neck and killed.
Right. And it's just, it's just, I mean, it's terrible, obviously. And then you have people's, intimate moments are now, across the country with people talking about this case. Could there have been an argument here for like a second degree murder? Because I was just like, I'm unfamiliar with Russian roulette other than the times you see it in movies. And it's like, to my
Right.
understanding, it's like, the famous like Deer Hunter film, if people have seen that, where
Right.
it's like one pull of the trigger and that's it. In this case, there
Mhm.
are three.
Mhm.
Could there have been an argument here for potentially like a second degree murder type charge?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, as you said, Chris, this is extreme Russian roulette. I mean, you don't take a chance and roll the cylinder and pull the trigger and you survive. No, here the trigger continued to be pulled, and so ultimately the question would be intent, and could you form intent from the first time you pulled the trigger to the third time. Maybe the idea is you play Russian roulette, you roll it, you pull the trigger one time, and that's it. But here's someone who's pulled the trigger three times. Does that make it different? Does that change the state of mind? Obviously, at this point, it doesn't appear that prosecutors believe that. At this point, it appears that this was really a bizarre, intimate act between the two of them for whatever thrills that it provided, and the death was accidental, and that's why I think they're pursuing the involuntary manslaughter.
How strong of a case for involuntary manslaughter does this appear to be from the prosecution side?
I think it's a strong case, based on what the defendant has already said, based on statements that were made, because obviously we have to believe that they pieced this together, based on the fact that someone explained what happened, and the only person who that could be is the defendant in this case. So those admissions are going to be very strong in terms of a prosecution. And secondly, involuntary manslaughter, by its very nature in the state of Virginia, the statute says that it's an accidental killing. And, for all intents and purposes, as we view this and as prosecutors have it, this looks like a very, very tragic accident.
Because then on the flip side of it, like I think for the defense, and there is, according to the narrative that's been given out, and we only know what she says, 'cause she's the only witness to this,
Mhm.
that he gave her the gun. And perhaps there's the argument that they could make that he was the one that, he's 26 years old. He went to college, served overseas. I mean, this was a very accomplished guy. And he sadly loses his life. Like if the defense were to argue that he was the one who was actually leading the charge that they were going to play this game, and he was the one that gave her the gun, he's the one that has it placed under his chin. And for the defense to almost make it seem like he was the one that was doing this, and then she was just kind of brought into it. Like, how do you make that argument to a jury? Would that be something potentially as a defense in a case where obviously we know at the end of the day, this gun goes off, she was there, and he loses his life?
Well, right, and I think that the defense may be analyzing that very closely, because, as you said, Chris, I mean, he's a college graduate. He's a 10-year veteran of the National Guard. He did a tour of service in Iraq, a deployment. I would think she's 19 years old. These guns, I would assume, belong to him. That he's a military person, and I'm making an assumption here, but there were 7 guns there, 2 of them sitting on the bed. I think they're probably his weapons. So the issue is, did he, as someone more mature, with more life experiences, in some way, get this 19-year-old young woman, although she's an adult, this 19-year-old young woman involved in this very dangerous sort of conduct and foreplay. So I'm sure that the defense is looking closely at who brought about this whole thrill-seeking Russian roulette involvement that resulted in his death.
And when it comes to like just what you understand from maybe cases you've worked on, when it comes to like ballistics, can you tell the difference between, someone, I mean, sadly, like with where the gun was pointed, we see a lot of cases of people who take their lives that way. We've seen cases where people will say this is, that it's someone who took their life, but then it ends up being a murder case. Like in this case, it doesn't appear that there was any struggle in terms of the gun and where it went off. Um, how does that potentially factor? If it shows that, I mean, if the ballistics doesn't tell you that there was any bit of struggle, I mean, can they even tell the difference? How does that factor into how this could play out in court?
Well, I think number one, you're going to look at and through forensics and other forensic analysis, they can tell exactly the trajectory of the bullet, and based on her statements and what she says happened, if that's consistent with what actually went on in that bedroom on that particular early morning. I think what's important when you look at forensics is not so much that it proves exactly what happened, but it can oftentimes disprove what someone is saying happened. And here again, I would assume that the work that they've done in terms of investigation is consistent with what the defendant has told them, because they're not proceeding with the murder charge. They're proceeding with an involuntary manslaughter charge. So it's going to be interesting to see, how this, unfolds and what the defense does in terms of trying to point the responsibility in a different direction.
And we have a long way to go until trial. This even gets to a trial situation, but the fact that she's the only witness, she's the one who potentially could go to prison for a decade. How likely is it, or if you were her defense attorney, and we'll fast forward to maybe this is at trial, she's pleaded not guilty, how likely is it that this would be a situation where getting your client to testify in their own defense would be a good idea?
Well, it's always a risk for a defendant to testify, and that's probably the most important decision that a defense team has to make, whether or not they put their defendant on the witness stand. Now, I don't know anything about any criminal history. She's a young woman, so she doesn't have a lot of history behind her. Is there anything that could be used to impeach her testimony if she were to testify? But that has to sort of unravel as you see what the prosecution is going to do in this case. I wouldn't be entirely surprised to see, again, based on statements that I haven't seen, that this case could end up in some sort of plea negotiation in order to resolve it. But that just depends what the defense believes they can do in this case. Obviously, they have no responsibility in this case. They don't have to prove anything. The prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But it would be anxious to say, I'd be anxious to see what plausible explanation the defense could have that would absolve her from criminal responsibility.
This now heads to a grand jury. And I know there's the old saying of like a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. A lot of ham sandwiches been indicted over the years. But like in this case, like where does that mean about like where we're at and like what could come next, especially when you start thinking like, is this a case where a plea deal would make sense?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, Chris, because, for instance, this is in Virginia, and in the jurisdiction where I practice in Pennsylvania, we don't have a preliminary hearing before a grand jury actually issues an indictment. So we kind of eliminate the grand jury, and we have the preliminary hearing as the first step in the case, and then it goes on to trial and pre-trial and things like that. So this is a little different way of going about procedurally. But yeah, I mean, you had a preliminary hearing. I don't see any reason why there would not be an indictment in this case. And then the case would move forward, through pretrial motions and ultimately to trial.
And if this goes to a grand jury, you know, this is a manslaughter case at this point. Like, is there a possibility, like, is a grand jury, like this case is able to come out where she's facing more charges than she did going in?
Well, it would depend what the prosecution presented to the grand jury. You know, if they put other options on the table other than involuntary manslaughter, it's possible. I don't think it's likely. I think this is a case that prosecutors believe is an involuntary manslaughter case, and I don't see that they're changing directions on that right at this point.
You know, this is, you know, we cover a lot of, you know, gun violence is just a reality, and true crime, sadly, it's a reality in many corners of this country and the world. I can't remember a case that was like this. You know, I think that there was one involving like an OnlyFans model and a man lost his life recently in a trial. But have you covered any, like, just in your time? How often do you see something like this?
You know, I haven't had a case in my career that dealt specifically with Russian roulette, and I think this case is unusual in a certain manner. You know, like you talked about the deer hunter. I mean, typically, you know, the Russian roulette is someone has a gun in their hand, in their own hand, and
Right.
they roll the cylinder and they pull the trigger and cause their own death. And I think there have been at least one case that I recall that got national attention where someone encouraged somebody else to play Russian roulette and to ultimately end their own life. You know, so you know, there's a lot of things here that are a little different. You know, some nuances to this case, but ultimately, it appears, at least from what we know at this point, and we can piece together that prosecutors and the defense are looking at this as a tragic accident. Prosecutors want her to be held responsible, even though it's an accident. And I'm sure the defense wants her to be absolved because it's an accident.
Well, I'm kind of going off a tangent here, just like a kind of like a last thought, but it's like, I remember like Diddy's trial, and like part of the defense for Diddy was like, hey, his lifestyle may not be something that makes sense to you. It's, you know, and this was his defense, that it was like, look, the guy is into some weird stuff. And that was part of the argument you make to the jury. Like, I think of this case, and depending on who the jury is, like if they were, you know, my parents, they blow their minds, you know, it would just be like, it would be hard to fathom that people would do what she's accused of being a part of. Like, as an attorney, how do you get a jury, especially if it's a group of people, like, you know, it's the church choir that happens to be on the jury, like to get them to at least kind of see it from your client's point of view, that to them may not be for you, but to them, this is normal. This is what they were into. And that's not, you know, for as weird as it may seem, that shouldn't be something that impacts their judgment on whether they would convict somebody.
Well, right. I mean, you know, when you get right down to it, if you're going to say that, you know, you're not responsible in some way, you know, it's a matter of consent. Was this involuntary? Was there some kind of coercion used against this defendant? We know there were a number of guns laying around there. You know, could the victim have had a gun pointed at the defendant saying, roll the cylinder, pull the trigger, or I'm going to shoot you? I mean, there's a lot of different possibilities here, and we're just, you know, going through scenarios that we're sort of dreaming up in our mind. But
Sure.
but that's the way cases work. I mean, that's what happens. Sometimes what seems so obvious to everyone is not as obvious as we think, and certainly when you're dealing with the jury and your lifestyle is much different than anything anybody on that jury has ever done, it makes it difficult. It makes trials difficult.
And we'll see what happens next. I mean, just a sad case, no doubt about it. You know, this was a guy who served this country, and, you know, as his family now hoping for justice. We'll see how it plays out from McSpadden's point of it, as she, at this point, facing this charge of involuntary manslaughter. Matt Mangino, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Chris. Great talking to you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.